All right. Glad to have everybody here on with us this evening. We've got Sheri Crabtree with Kentucky State University. She's an extension associate. I think I'm correct when I say that. There at Kentucky State University. And she joined us back in the fall and discussed pawpaws. And we actually had a request for gooseberries. So she's going to be talking about that and a little bit more in her presentation tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sheri, okay?
All right. Well, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you all for coming. Thanks for having me back. Good to see you all. I know some of you were there for my pawpaw presentation in the fall, and I think there's a few new faces too. So we are going to talk about growing gooseberries and currants. Let me see about sharing my screen. It always takes me a few minutes to figure out the screen sharing. Okay, I'll start the slideshow. Can you all see that okay?
Looks great, thank you.
All right, great. Okay, so growing gooseberries and currants. Like Jeremy said, my name's Sheri Crabtree. I am a horticulture research and extension associate at Kentucky State University, which is in Frankfort, Kentucky. So gooseberries and currants are the same genus. They're both ribes. They're different species. They're berry-producing shrubs. So there are white, red, pink, and black currants. There are gooseberries. There's American gooseberries, European gooseberries, and they're all kind of mixed together at this point, but they range from green to yellow to red when they're ripe. Even though they're the same genus, they look fairly different. One of the main differences is gooseberry plants have thorns and currants do not. You'll notice that when you're picking them, for sure. There's quite a bit of history with gooseberries and currants in the US. They're very popular in Europe. So in the very early times of settlers in the US, 1629, which is really early on, there were records of black currants being imported and grown in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So around 1899, ribes production was actually pretty big in the US. There was over 7,000 acres grown in the US, mostly in the Northeast and New York, that area of the Northeast. However, around that same time, white pine blister rust, which is a disease that affects white pines but has two hosts, so it has black currants and white pine as the alternate host, became a problem around that time. So ribes cultivation was actually banned in the US in 1912 to try to prevent the spread of that disease. Then they lifted the federal ban in 1966 for several reasons, mostly because resistant and immune varieties were developed. So probably mostly due to them being banned for so long, for over 50 years, gooseberries and currants were kind of forgotten in the US. And so production has never got back to the same level that it was back in the 1800s. So there's only about 2,500 acres produced in the US. And this is mostly in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest. And most black currants worldwide are produced in Europe, especially in Russia, Poland, and Germany. So if you want to grow gooseberries and currants, and we'll go through all these in more detail, first you want to select disease-resistant cultivars, partly for white pine blister rust, and also these are susceptible to powdery mildew, which can be a problem in Kentucky. If you do select these disease-resistant cultivars, they can be grown organically in Kentucky. You want to plant them in late fall or pretty early in the spring because they start growing pretty early in the spring. The life cycle, they're fairly long-lived, so about 8 to 15 years for a currant planting, 15 to 20 years for a gooseberry planting. When you plant them, you want currants about 3 to 4 feet apart, gooseberries about 4 to 5 feet apart. They have about a 3 to 6 foot height and spread, and then leave about 8 to 10 feet between rows, just depending on what kind of equipment you need to get between rows. And you can propagate these yourself pretty easily with cuttings or tip layering if they're not patented. So if you want to propagate plants yourself, currants, you can just take cuttings of dormant wood in the winter, and you do want to dip that in like a rooting hormone powder and just put in potting soil, cover it, and they'll root pretty quickly. You do want to keep them in the shade for the first year or so while they establish. Gooseberries propagate better through tip layering, which, if you're familiar with that with blackberries, you basically bend the cane over so that it's touching the soil, kind of hold it down with a hook, something like that, to hold it down and cover it with soil. And that stem will produce roots where it's buried in the soil. And after it does that, you can remove that and plant it as its own separate plant. Gooseberries and currants are very cold hardy. USDA growing zones 3 to 8, and we are zone 6 in Kentucky. They can bloom early, so that can be a problem in Kentucky. You know, we often have we get warm and then we have late spring freezes. So for a few reasons, north or northeast facing slopes are ideal. One, it helps prevent that early flowering because it stays a little cooler, so it helps keep them from getting prematurely warm and leafing out and flowering too early. But these like cooler temperatures in general anyway. Remember, they're grown in Europe. In the US, they're grown a lot in the Northeast and Pacific Northwest. So they really like cooler temperatures, ideally, than what we usually have here. And also for that reason, part shade is best in this area. Morning sun and afternoon shade is best because the heat and the strong sun here and the humidity can be kind of hard on them. You do want to avoid the very lowest lying areas where cold air can accumulate. There will be frost pockets since they do bloom fairly early. And because powdery mildew is an issue, kind of hillside is an ideal site, somewhere that has good air circulation to reduce the chances of powdery mildew. So gooseberries and currants like a cool, moist, but well-drained soil that's pretty high in organic matter, slightly acid to neutral pH, about 6 to 7. Mulch is really beneficial for gooseberries and currants. It helps keep the soil cooler since they do like cooler temperatures, cooler roots, and also helps conserve soil moisture and helps with weed control. We do generally need to irrigate in the summer in Kentucky. You want to be getting at least an inch of rain per week. And fertilization, just a balanced fertilizer, so 10-10-10, and about 4 or 5 ounces per plant when they're younger, a little bit more when they're older. And also just manure, composted manure is a good fertilizer, adds nitrogen and also adds organic matter. You don't want to over-fertilize them though. If you get a lot of really vigorous vegetative green growth, that can help kind of increase powdery mildew, makes that more of a problem. So as far as maintaining the plants, pruning them, they are multi-stem shrubs, so they're not going to be trained to just one trunk. They're going to have multiple stems. Most of the fruit are produced on 2- and 3-year-old shoots. The older shoots produce very little fruit. So you want to, we'll go into this in more detail, remove the shoots as they get older and kind of have a cycle of stems of different ages on the plants. You want to prune them in late winter, early spring. Cut out any weak spindly canes, branches that are kind of laying down on the ground, and branches that are too crowded. So gooseberries and red and white currants, when they're mature, should have about 8 to 10 bearing canes, and black currants a little bit more, about 10 to 15 bearing canes. The first year, actually right after planting, you want to head them back. You do cut them back when they're planted. So after their first year, you want to select about 6 or 8 of the healthiest, most vigorous looking canes. Then in the second year, you keep about the 4 best of the 2-year-old canes, and you choose 4 or 5 the best looking 1-year-old canes. Year 3, you want to have about 3 or 4 canes of each age that are good, strong, vigorous canes. Year 4, you remove the oldest canes, and you kind of start the cycle over again. You choose the best 1-year-old canes and remove the oldest canes. So each year you remove the oldest and select the strongest new canes to leave. There are some diseases and pests that we see on gooseberry and currants. Powdery mildew is probably the biggest problem for us in Kentucky. We did see some septoria leaf spot and anthracnose. We did not see a lot of the insect issues. We didn't see any white pine blister rust, but pretty much all the cultivars that we grew were resistant to it. And we didn't have a lot of white pines nearby at our site anyway, but that's not really a huge problem anymore. But we will talk about it because it's kind of a big historic thing, even if it's not super prevalent in Kentucky and in this area. But like we mentioned in the introduction, early in the 1900s, this white pine blister rust became a pretty serious disease problem in the US. White pines were a really important timber tree, lumber tree. So, this was a big detriment to that industry. And white pine blister rust, it's kind of like cedar apple rust, if you're familiar with that. It needs two plants to complete its life cycle. So it needs a black currant as the alternate host, and then a white pine is what it actually causes the most damage to complete its life cycle. So to try to prevent the spread of white pine blister rust, the federal government banned the planting and cultivation of currants and gooseberries in the early 20th century. Not only that, they tried to eradicate native plants too. They had people go out and try to eradicate wild plants from the woods also to prevent the spread of this disease. In 1966, the federal ban was lifted, partly because more research was done that showed that you could grow black currants. You do want them to be a little distance away from white pines, but more importantly, these cultivars that are disease resistant or developed. This is what it looks like. It's on the gooseberry or currant leaves. It's really just, small brown spots, look similar to a lot of other rust disease, but it's really destructive on white pine trees. Again, we never saw that in our planting. In Kentucky, there are no restrictions at all on ribes production. Remember, I said the federal ban was lifted. So the federal ban was lifted, but there are some states that they're still on the books. And I'll mention, because I know there's some people from Virginia, there are some laws about ribes production in Virginia. Basically, the hybridized black currants that are resistant to white pine blister rust, red and white currants, and gooseberries are okay to grow in Virginia. Black currants that are susceptible to white pine blister rust are still not permitted to be grown in Virginia. And again, in most states, that's the case. It's really only susceptible black currants that are regulated. So you want to stay, if you're growing a variety that is susceptible at all, or even just has moderate resistance to white pine blister rust, you do want to be a good distance away from white pine trees. And there are consort, coronet, crusader, and titania are nearly immune, very resistant to near immune to white pine blister rust. Bensaric is resistant, kind of moderately resistant. And again, that's what the white pine blister rust looks like on the currants, kind of a orange brown colored rust spot on the leaves. This is really what we saw the most of in our trial, is powdery mildew, which of course is a problem on a lot of different plants. And cultural control is one of the most important things. There are resistant cultivars. You want to have good air circulation. You don't want to have a lot of leaf moisture, because leaf moisture promotes, especially powdery mildew, really any fungal disease requires leaf moisture. So you want to choose, again, a site that's going to have good airflow. You want the plants to be spaced out appropriately and pruned appropriately so you have good airflow and the leaves don't stay wet. And for that same reason, you want to avoid overhead irrigation or watering with, with a hose, with a sprinkler. You either want to do drip irrigation, or if you just have a few plants, you can just put a hose at the base of the plants. But you want to avoid leaf wetness as much as possible. And if it is still a problem, sulfur fungicides work well against powdery mildew. We did see this more often on currants than on gooseberries. However, this one we saw more on gooseberry, septoria leaf spot. And anthracnose I just put on the same slide because it looks very similar to septoria leaf spot, and the causes and control are similar. And again, the causes and control are kind of similar to the powdery mildew also, because it's another fungal disease. So again, you want to have good airflow, pruning, good site selection, and not use overhead irrigation to try to prevent leaf wetness. Any leaves that drop that are damaged, if you have a problem with this disease, you want to remove them and destroy them so they're not there building up inoculum. And copper-based fungicides work well against these. There are some insects. We did not see much of these, but these do exist in gooseberry and currants. There is a fruit worm that is the moth that you see is the adult of the fruit worm. And to prevent that, you basically want to harvest the fruit promptly, get in the refrigerator. You don't want to leave fruit over-ripening on the bush and overripe or rotting fruit laying on the ground. The gooseberry sawfly, which is the bottom picture, the larvae of that feed on the leaves of gooseberries. And fortunately, harvest of these is early enough that you avoid spotted-winged Drosophila. Spotted-winged Drosophila is a big problem for us in blackberries and blueberries, fruits like that. But we harvest gooseberries and currants early enough that it avoids the main populations of those. Birds like pretty much all berries, I think, but especially colorful, the black and red and pink colored berries they like. So we covered ours with netting. You can use, there's those alarms, tying pie tins to trees, using those bird scares that look like owls or scarecrows. And those are kind of, marginally successful. Birds usually figure that out and ignore them after a while. But so netting is really the best way to control birds. So for choosing cultivars, what cultivars do well in Kentucky, gooseberries and red and white currants are self-fruitful, but you get higher yields with cross-pollination. So even if they're considered self-fruitful, it's really better to plant at least 2 different cultivars. Black currants, some of them require cross-pollination. Coronet and Crusader need cross-pollination. The others are partially self-fertile, but again, you get better yields with cross-pollination. These are pollinated by bumblebees and other bee species. And the European gooseberries, usually they're the more commercialized varieties, have a better flavor, a larger fruit, but they have more disease susceptibility. And American gooseberries were smaller, but more disease resistant. So a lot of these have been crossed and hybridized over the years. Most of what's considered American gooseberry cultivars today have some European in their background from breeding back in the 1800s. So we'll go through these and show some pictures, but these cultivars did well for us in Kentucky. Hinnomaki red and poor man gooseberries, Titania and Bensaric black currants, Red Star ovata and Yonkir vantet, red currants, and white currants, white imperial or primus and blanca. And we did look at a few Yasta berries. ORUS 10 did best for us. So we'll talk about them in more detail. Black currants, Titania is one that we recommend for our area. It's immune to white pine blister rust. It also is resistant to powdery mildew. The fruit size is pretty large, has good yields and good fruit quality. Ben Lamond is one that was in our trial. It's grown a lot in Europe. It's what they use a lot for black currant juice, which is a popular product there. It is susceptible to white pine blister rust, so we would not recommend it if you're growing it anywhere near white pines. If you don't have them around, it's a good cultivar. It has some resistance to mildew, not fully resistant. Bensaric is another one that we recommend. It is resistant to white pine blister rust. It also has a pretty compact bush size. It only gets to 3 or 4 feet tall. And again, it has high yields and large fruit. Here's a couple others that we don't recommend. Consort, the fruit quality was not very good. The yields were low. It is resistant to white pine blister rust, but it's very susceptible to powdery mildew. And Crusader is kind of similar to Consort in all of those characteristics, and it's also not self-fertile. So Crandall is kind of different. Crandall is a different species than the other black currants that we talked about. Sometimes people call it a black currant, but it's usually called a clove currant, is generally what it's called. It's a native North American species. One of its main characteristics, it has yellow fragrant flowers in the spring. So sometimes it's grown almost as much as an ornamental as for fruit. The fruit is good. It tastes pretty different than the European black currants. So white currants are usually used for these juices and jellies and things like that. Crandall wouldn't really work because it tastes quite a bit different, but it is a Native American variety. It does have nice fragrant flowers in the spring. It's a little better suited to our heat, and it is resistant to white pine blister rust and powdery mildew. So this is some data that we collected. So basically you see all of them had pretty good vigor. Crandall, Ben Sarek, and Ben Lamond had larger berry sizes. Consort and Crusader had fairly small berries. They were all resistant to white pine blister rust except for Ben Lamond. And Crandall, Ben Sarek, and Ben Lamond were resistant to powdery mildew. We didn't see leaf spot on these currants, or on the black currants. Titania is one that we recommend for planting. Crandall was also a good one for us, and Ben Sarek. There is one that we did not have in our trial that's pretty new, this Menage, I don't even know how to pronounce this, Menage Smirreau, which is a new cultivar that was not in our trial. I see it being highly recommended now, but it's a newer cultivar from after we already had our trial in. It is resistant to white pine blister rust and powdery mildew, and I see it recommended a lot now too. So I would add that to the list of ones to try. White currants tend to not be as high yielding in general as black currants. So we had Primus, White Imperial were the two that we had in our trial. Primus was pretty good. It was somewhat low yielding, but the white currants tend to be, White Imperial is susceptible to white pine blister rust. So again, wouldn't recommend that near white pines. Blanca seems to be the most recommended variety now, which again was not in our trial, but I think that would be the white currant to try. It's higher yielding and more vigorous than the other white currants. We had pink champagne, which I think is worth growing. It's just for its unique fruit characteristics. It had good flavor. It was a little bit sweeter than most of the white currants and had kind of a translucent pink berry. The yields were fairly low and it was not resistant to powdery mildew though, but just the color of it was so unique that I think it's worth having a few plants of. On the red currants, Jonquière Van Tet, high yields, good flavor. It is resistant to powdery mildew. Red Lake would only recommend if you don't have the white pines around. It was vigorous, productive, had good quality fruit, but is susceptible to both diseases, to powdery mildew and white pine blister rust. Red Start also has high yields and is disease resistant. Ravada is somewhat susceptible to powdery mildew, but it's later blooming, which remember they're early blooming, so that's a good quality to have here and has large fruit. Viking also is somewhat resistant to powdery mildew. So those are some red currants that are worth trying. So looking at the red and white currants, these are the ones that were in our trial. Again, Blanca and Ravada and Viking were not in our trial. So they were really, pretty similar yield and berry weight. Yields, again, not as high as the black currants. And white pine blister rust resistant, all of them except White Imperial and Red Lake. And all somewhat resistant, just fair resistance to powdery mildew. So Yasta berries are a gooseberry black currant cross, and the fruit is more similar to a gooseberry, and it's a little bit larger than a currant. We had a few of these in our trial, one that's just called Yasta, and these are thornless, so they're similar to currants in that they're thornless. The fruit's a little bit more like gooseberries. Yasta was resistant to powdery mildew and white pine blister rust. We did see, I mentioned this, kind of some funny russeting on the leaves, but that was not any kind of disease issue. There's some that were released by Oregon State University. ORUS 10 was one that did well for us. Vigorous, this one is thorny, but it's resistant to mold, powdery mildew, and white pine blister rust, and had a good flavor. ORUS 8 was also pretty vigorous and disease resistant to the mold and mildew and white pine blister rust, but we did see some of that septoria leaf spot and anthracnose on that one. So of the Yasta berries, ORUS 10 is the one that performed best for us. You see higher yields and disease resistant. So gooseberries, Hinamaki Red, this is one that we would recommend. It had the most unique flavor to me. It had a kind of raspberry-like flavor. It was like a tart, crunchy raspberry almost. And texture on the gooseberries is similar to a grape, if you haven't had them before, kind of like a crunchy grape. So these are red when they're ripe. It was disease resistant. It was somewhat low growing, so you tend to have branches almost on the ground. We didn't trellis them. You can use a wire and kind of tie them up on a trellis to help them from being so close to the ground and help be a little bit easier to harvest from. Amish Red also performed pretty well in our trial, had a good flavor, has kind of a red blush when it's ripe. It was also disease resistant. Poor Man is widely available. It has good flavor, again, kind of a red blush to red berry when it's ripe. However, it was not as disease resistant. We saw the septoria leaf spot and anthracnose on this one, which you can see on the plant in the picture, some of the leaf spot. Pixel gets its name because you see the berries are on longer stems that hang down a little bit down below. You see in this picture how thorny that stem is too. I don't think there'd been any other close-ups of the stem. So you can see why that's a good characteristic for the berries to hang down lower so you don't have to come in close contact with the stem. But unfortunately, that was really all it had going for it. The flavor was not very good. The texture wasn't very good, had kind of a mushy texture. So unfortunately, that one didn't do well for us, even though the low-hanging berries was a good characteristic. These are a few others that we did not recommend. Invicta, that just had poor survival for us. Jan's Prairie had leaf spot, pretty bad. Captivator also had leaf spot problems. It is kind of semi-thornless, but again, it had disease issues for us here. So some other gooseberries that are worth a try that were not in our trial that have been released, most of them are newer and have been released since then. Tixia has good quality fruit, large bright red fruit, and the thorns, there's supposed to be fewer thorns, and the thorns are a little bit more soft, so they won't get you quite as bad. Glendale, I thought sounded really interesting because it's supposed to be best for hotter areas. It's more tolerant of the southern heat and humidity. And the others, really, they do suffer in the heat in Kentucky. You can kind of tell they start looking kind of droopy during the hottest, driest part of the year. So Glendale would be good for us. Jean is resistant to powdery mildew. It's a fairly new release from Oregon State University. Black Velvet is late ripening and has kind of a blueberry grape-like fruit. So these are some that are worth a try. We don't have data from them from the trial. And again, Amish Red, high yields, good vigor, good disease resistance, and Hinamaki Red also had good yields, disease resistance. So those are two that we would recommend for this area. If you're interested in buying gooseberries and currants, there are several nurseries that sell them that are somewhat, not really local, but at least in this region. Indiana Berry and Plant Company and Brambleberry Farm are both in Indiana. Stark Brothers Nursery in Missouri, and a couple on the West Coast that I would recommend, One Green World and Rain Tree Nursery. And all of these are mail order. So even though they're not local to us, they all ship by mail order. You may happen upon a gooseberry and currant plant at your local, Lowe's or local garden center, but not, they're not super common. So really mail order from these bigger companies that, especially the ones that kind of specialize in small fruits. So harvesting gooseberry and currants, they usually take about 3 years to get to full production. It says 4 years, but really it's about by year 3, you get full production. Gooseberries, you're looking at about 4 to 5 quarts per bush or 8 to 10 pounds per plant. Currants take about the same amount of time, about 3 years to full production, and a little bit lower yielding, about 5 to 8 pounds per plant. You do get the best fruit production on 2 to 3 year old wood. So remember how you kind of cycle the pruning. So you have wood of different ages at the same time on the plant. And you'll see a few berries in year 2 and pretty much a full crop by year 3. And for sure by year 4, you're in full production. They ripen over about 3 to 4 week period in June and July in this area. Most of them, color change indicates ripeness. There's some of those gooseberries we mentioned, not any of them that we recommend, but some cultivars like Invicta stay green even when they're ripe. But in general, the color change tells you when they're ready. Gooseberries are picked individually. Currants are in bunches, almost kind of like grapes, like a loose bunch of grapes. And these are hand harvested. In Europe, where ribes are a bigger industry, there's actually machine harvesters, but it's not a big enough industry here. There's not really a need for machine harvest for most growers. And you can harvest them weekly. You don't have to go out and harvest them every day because there's a little bit of leeway in picking them. They'll stay on the bush when they're ripe. When they're really overripe, they will drop, but they'll stay on the bush for a few days when they're ripe. So weekly harvest is what we would recommend. These are really nutritious. Black currants especially are high in vitamin C. They're high in antioxidants. And you see comparison, looking at vitamin C in particular, black currant is higher, over twice as much vitamin C as you find in oranges. And red currants, gooseberries are also relatively high in vitamin C, kind of comparable to strawberries. So these are a good source of antioxidants, good source of vitamin C, vitamin A also. So what can you do with gooseberry and currant fruit? Well, when you harvest them, you want to refrigerate them immediately after harvest, just like any other fruit, so they don't start to deteriorate. And you can freeze them whole for longer term storage. These are mostly used for processing. Currants in particular are pretty tart and astringent if you eat them fresh. So they're pretty much completely used for processing. Mostly jelly and juice and liqueur. If you've heard of cassis, that's a black currant liqueur. Gooseberries have more potential for fresh eating than currants do. They're kind of sweet tarts. I like them for fresh eating, but a lot of people will make them into different baked goods, jams, things like that also. And wine, I've seen gooseberry wine also. But the gooseberries are a little bit sweeter to eat fresh or to include, salad. You'll see salads with raspberries and raspberry vinaigrette. I think gooseberries would work really well in an application like that. And one thing that I just thought was kind of interesting is that the purple Skittles in most of Europe are black currant flavored rather than grape. So you can kind of see from that how much more popular black currants are in Europe than they are here in the US. As far as marketing, what you're looking at for a commercial grower, of average retail price of about $3.50 per pound, $5 or $6 a quart. And that adds up to about $6,000 to $8,000 per acre return possible. And, gooseberries and currants, they are a minor crop, and I won't say a new crop because they've been around so long, but they're new to a lot of people here that aren't familiar with them. So I would establish a market before putting in a large planting. You know, if you're already selling to local restaurants or to a local winery, talk to them, say, you know, would you be interested in gooseberries or currants and using those? I would also start small. The demand probably would not support a lot of large commercial plantings in Kentucky. I would recommend them to growers because they're so unique as something to diversify with other crops. I do think they're worth growing even on a commercial scale, but I don't think there's a market for, you know, 30 people to put in multiple acre plantings of ribes in Kentucky. But if you're already growing blackberries and raspberries, other small fruits, yeah, put in a dozen, 2 dozen plants and, you know, see what happens, and you can grow from there. If you get a good market for those, you can always build on that. So again, gooseberries and currants, do think they have potential for a small scale crop at farmers markets, the fresh fruit, but probably even more so the products, the jellies and jams, things like that. We do need more research on production and marketing because it still is a relatively unknown crop here. And some recommendations that did well in our trial, again, are below: the Hinnomaki Red and Poor Man gooseberries, Titania, Ben Lomond, Ben Sarek, black currants, Ravada and Yonkir Ventet, red currants, white imperial and primus, white currants, and the ORUS 10 Yostaberry. So that is it. So I would be glad, let me reopen this, and I would be glad to take any questions that anyone has.
If you have any questions, feel free to type it in the chat pod, or you can even unmute yourself if you'd like.
Sheri?
Yes.
A few years ago, I was researching fruit crops that are somewhat deer resistant. And there were 3 that just kept popping up. One was figs, and then currants and gooseberries. Is that what you're seeing? I mean, from your experience, that deer really don't mess with currants and gooseberries very much?
Yeah, we did not see any deer damage in our planting, and we do have deer on our farm. So there is some deer pressure there, and they never bothered the gooseberries and currants. I don't know on the gooseberries if them being thorny had anything to do with it. And the currants, the black currants have kind of, even the leaves have kind of a strong smell to them. So I don't know if that kind of repels deer also, but yeah, we did not have any problem with deer browsing in our planting.
Right.
Sheri, I had a question for you since it's supposed to be a cicada year. Do we know if there's a problem with those like there are with other thin stemmed fruits?
Well, I'm trying to remember if we still had those when the cicadas emerged. I guess it was 17 years ago. I guess they're 17-year periodical cicadas. And they did not bother them. I don't know if I know they like small diameter twigs, but it seems like, to me, they like trees more than low to the ground bushes. At least that's where we saw the most damage, was on our pawpaw trees and apple trees, on the really small twigs on those. So we did not see damage. I don't know if we were just lucky or if they don't like them. I haven't seen anything about them being resistant to cicadas, but we didn't see damage on our gooseberries or currants that year that we had the cicadas. And I don't know if it's because, you know, they're pretty low to the ground and they're pretty bushy. It's not like an exposed twig that's easy for the cicadas, you know, to get on and oviposit on, which is what caused the damage, is they, you know, saw part of the twig to lay their eggs. So being so bushy, in addition to the thorns, it probably deters them.
They love blueberries, and that's why.
Did they?
But our blueberries were close to the woods. So I don't know where your research plots are. If they're far enough away from the woods, maybe it's less of an issue.
Yeah, they were somewhat away from the woods, but they were near our pawpaws, and we did have cicada damage on our pawpaws. So it may not be, it's probably not their preferred place to lay eggs because they apparently preferred the pawpaws over the gooseberries and currants.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Sheri, Joyce asked if raccoons were a problem, that she had raccoons in her garden.
We didn't have raccoon issues, and we do have raccoons definitely get into, like, when the pawpaws fall on the ground, they eat the pawpaw fruit that are on the ground. We didn't notice any raccoon going in and eating the berries, any kind of raccoon damage. Trying to figure out how to maximize this again so I can see you all better. So yeah, the raccoons did not bother our gooseberries and currants. And again, I don't know if your pressure is higher. I wouldn't say that they 100% wouldn't, but we did not see that happen. If you had really, really high raccoon pressure, it's possible, but it didn't seem to be, again, something that they preferred.
The Yostaberry sound promising to me. I mean, do you have a personal opinion about that as far as just a backyard personal use crop? Would it be a better option in a lot of cases, you think, than gooseberries or currants, or is it in the same ballpark?
Well, they were more disease resistant than the gooseberries. So I liked the flavor of the gooseberries a little bit more. The black currants really are more just for processing, as far as I'm concerned. But as far as fresh eating, I liked the gooseberries more than the Yostaberry, but the Yostaberries were more disease resistant. So I think they definitely have a place here where disease pressure is high. But I wouldn't say the fruit quality was quite as good as the straight gooseberries.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Who's doing the bulk of the research on these in the US? Is it NC State or somebody up north? Do you know?
They mostly farther north. They've done a lot at Oregon State University. And I think there's some in the Northeast. I think there some like at Cornell and at Vermont, University of Vermont, and some Northeast universities. I think they're interesting. I think they're worth growing. So I don't want to say anything, but I think they just don't like our heat here as well, as why the research tends to be in northern areas. There's not a lot of people in the South that are doing research on them. I think because the heat is kind of hard on them. So it's generally places in the Northwest and the Northeast that are doing research on them. I don't know if I at NC State working with them, but I know they do a lot of small fruits there. But it's mostly Oregon State and then some up in the Northeast also.
I have one other question. Joyce wanted to know if she could get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation.
Sure. Yeah, I would be glad to.
Good deal.
Yeah.
Well, you feel free to send it to however, and I can make sure she gets that.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say either, yeah, I can send it to you and you can forward it to her.
That'd be good.
I was going to type.
I may want a copy of that myself.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll send it to Jeremy and he can forward it to anybody who wants to. I was gonna type my email address in chat, and for some reason I'm still sharing my screen, I think is why. Sorry. I'm sorry. There's chat. I will type my email address in chat. So if anybody wants to email me, if you have any questions or to get the PowerPoint, but I can send it to Jeremy and he can send it on to you guys.
That works. That'll be great.
Yeah. But yeah, if you think of any other questions or need anything else, then that is my email address. And feel free to reach out.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Like I said, it has been a while since we had this trial. When I was going through it again and then reading about some of the new cultivars, it made me want to plant some more, because I saw, especially the ones that said they were more heat tolerant. I was like, oh, we need to get some more of these out and try the heat tolerant cultivars and see how they do. So
Great,
yeah,
great.
maybe start growing them again.
Great presentation. Thank you so much. We appreciate it definitely. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
But thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate the great information you gave us.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope I hear about some people growing gooseberries and currants and yastaberries over in Eastern Kentucky and Southwest Virginia now.
We'll keep you updated and maybe have you for a visit when they get started. How's that?
Definitely, yeah, that would be great.
All right.
That would be good. So, all right.
Well, thank you very much. Phil, Shad, do y'all have anything to add or discuss for next week's Mountain Zoom?
Well, Tuesday will be birding by ear and sight. That's going to be by Rachel Blevin. She's a naturalist down at Natural Tunnel State Park in near Duffield, Virginia. And I don't remember what's coming up Thursday. Do you all remember? I don't have
it in front of me. Sorry.
Eagles. It was Mitch with the Eagles.
Okay.
Yeah.
That link, you sent out the new link today, correct? For the birding?
Yes, correct.
Okay, good deal. I think that'll be a good one. I'm looking forward to that one.
Definitely.
That sounds interesting.
Well, if there's nothing else, I guess we'll call it a night. It's great to see everybody on here tonight. And come back and join us next Tuesday, and we'll discuss birding by ear. How's that? But everybody have a great evening. Have a great weekend. They're calling for some rain. Hopefully we won't get all the rain that they're saying, but definitely watch that in the forecast. So everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Thank you.